There seems to be some confusion surrounding the character of Morph, and that is if they're an original character of the 90s X-Men the animated series, or if the character is from the comics, and the answer is kind of both. Yet at the same time, also neither. So let's talk about it. Now to specify, the character from the 97 show and the animated series continuity, who are one and the same, uses they/them pronouns, being non-binary. However, the character that it's based on from the comics is male, using he/him pronouns. Therefore, when I talk about the character from the show and that continuity, I will be using they/them pronouns. While talking about the comics, I'll be using he/him. The character's inclusion in the original series came from the basis that the showrunners wanted a member of the team to die, to show that the stakes were high. Now in the comics, the member that was killed off pretty early on was Thunderbird, that being part of the second lineup of the X-Men. Thunderbird is John Proudstar, who you might recognize from the Gifted TV show where the character had a pretty prominent role, a show that I really miss. You also might know his brother Warpath, who's a more popular character. While Thunderbird in the comics was one to die, series developer Eric Lewald decided against the idea, for the fact they didn't want to kill off one of the few Native American characters from comics. Therefore, the death role would be replaced, that with a different mutant. Enter Morph. I also wanted to point out that Thunderbird is oddly added to the villain team in the original show's intro, which is really weird because the character has never been a villain in the comics. And in the show itself, the character still cameos, and he's still not a villain. Some have argued saying that it's actually Warpath, not Thunderbird, but even then, Warpath was a villain for like a brief second. And even when he was more antagonistic than villainous. Now, the character would be replaced in the intro with Emma Frost and Lady Deathstrike, that in the 97 TV show, continuation of the original show. But I'm still confused as why the character was added in the first place. Even Juggernaut's inclusion's a little weird because he's not a mutant. Yet he's a part of the Brotherhood of Evil Mutants for some reason, which he isn't in the show. Intro's still great, just a little confused by this lineup. During research, Eric came across a different mutant in the comics to die, that being Changeling. A shapeshifter like Mystique, although unlike her, he has the abilities of whoever he transforms into. First appearing in X-Men issue 35 from 1967, only to then sacrifice his life in issue 42 from 1968, as in, he was a very short-run character, who no one ever heard of. Okay, that's mean. Probably not no one, but most people had never heard of. Now, a brief summary of the character Changeling in these few issues is that they're a mutant named Kevin Sidney. Sidney with a Y, by the way, that's very important. Who's a shapeshifter, and after some misunderstanding will become a trusted ally of the X-Men. Unfortunately, Kevin will be diagnosed with cancer, and thinking that his life was doomed, he would save Professor X's life by impersonating him, resulting in his own death. The character wasn't wildly popular, or that known, to even hardcore X-Men fans. Since this series was taking place in the 90s, and this comic came out in the mid-60s, there was a more than likely chance that modern readers had no idea who this character was. And if they did, they probably didn't care. Therefore, to take this character and make them the one who dies was very pleasing, as it probably wouldn't upset anybody. But, you see, there was a problem. The name Changeling is already used, or was over at DC. That by Garfield Logan, who is also most known as Beast Boy, but at the time the character used the name Changeling. So they couldn't use that name on the series. Instead, they renamed him Morph, which, if I'm being honest, I do think is a cooler name. Even over at DC, I never liked Changeling being Beast Boy's name. Therefore, the character of Morph will be added to the X-Men. But there was another problem. Yes, another problem. You see, Changeling being a very short-lived character resulted in him not really having a personality. Therefore, instead, the character of Morph was instead portrayed as a jokester, almost giving them the friendship of Wolverine and personality of Nightcrawler, with Wolverine going on to say that they were the only one that could ever make him laugh, something that is usually said about Nightcrawler in the comics. Like proposed, Morph would be killed off in the show's two-parter pilot, that by Sentinel, and they would be motivation for the X-Men going forward surrounding mutant hate, especially Wolverine, along with showing how dangerous that these anti-mutant acts really can be, and Sentinels themselves. It did a really good job by raising the stakes of the series, right from the get-go. which is what Eric wanted. However, in the show's second season, Morph would return thanks to Mr. Sinister, which might be semi-inspired by the Angel turning into Archangel arc from the comics, as that too is Mr. Sinister bringing back a dead X-Men to work for him. Although here it's Morph, who, when he was brought back, was met with many praise. Therefore, the character was turned into reoccurring, eventually reforming and joining the X-Men again, however in a more honorable member role opposed to their previous staple on the team. And by staple, I mean 2 episodes, before being killed. The character of Morph has many differences from the character of Changeling from the comics. Yes, they both are shapeshifters who both do die, but everything else is completely different. As in, original concepts being added to this character, down to the name. Therefore, in a weird way, they're both kinda an original character, but at the same time they're inspired by a character from the comics. This version of the character will be popular enough to be brought into the comics, that being Age of Apocalypse, however in a different manner, that being as an alternate version of Morph from another world. Or an alternate version of Changeling, who is also named Morph, who would go on to join the Exiles. This version of the character is actually pretty cool, and a great addition to the Exiles team, which is actually one of my favorite comics from the early 2000s. I highly recommend it if you haven't read it yet. There would also be a really random retcon with the character, involving their last name. You see, in the 60s, their last name was Sydney with a Y, but for some reason in the early 2000s, the character was renamed to Sydney with an I, that being in the Marvel Encyclopedia from 2004. These additions are typically just disregarded when it comes down to typos, or simply misinformation, which does happen, oddly more than you would think, but for some reason this typo became actually canon. And onward, the character would be referred to Sydney with an I, which I suppose doesn't really matter, and I didn't need to mention it, but it bothered me for some reason. Because out of nowhere, the character started to be called a different name, with no real explanation as to why. I mean, technically it's not a different name, it's just the same name spelled differently, but I still don't like it. Morph has recently returned to the animated continuity, that being in the 97 X-Men show. 97 as in its name, not the year it came out, where they become a main character of the show, now sporting a more or less similar look to the character from the comics. They also even get a title card, which is actually a pretty cool addition. Only because a complaint I did have with the original series is because it always focused on the same X-Men. Always, always, always the same people. Who, by the way, I all love. Well, I don't really like Jean, but I like most of them. But a big part of the X-Men is they're constantly rotating the roster. Therefore, to add characters like Morph, Magneto, and Bishop to the title cards, I think is a nice touch. The character likes how to come out non-binary. They're also dealing with some PTSD from being resurrected by Mr. Sinister, a concept that I really like. Because often in comics, when characters are resurrected, there's not really merit to the reason why they were dead in the first place, or as how they were resurrected. Instead, it feels more like a retcon. But here, Morph's death is actually very important to their story, and going forward with their resurrection. A concept that I think is only started to scratch the surface of, and I hope to see more of going forward in the show. Their friendship with Wolverine is also really wholesome, which I do appreciate as a fan of Wolverine and Nightcrawler's relationship in the comics. Relationship as in friendship, not the other way of saying relationship. And that's Morph, a character who I actually really like, which is interesting enough to note because I am not someone that likes resurrection. Yet in this story, I think it works perfectly. Which of course is just me. Some people do think that the character should have stayed dead, but of course everyone has their own opinions. And that's it. Like always, please like, subscribe, and I'll see you guys next time. Bye!